Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are at around the world. My name is Curtis Garten. I'm with Oculus, and we are very happy to be with you today as part of the CrisisMappers webinar series. We're going to continue the series today with another presentation. Just to give you guys a little bit of context around who we are here at Oculus and what do we do, I thought I'd just spend 2 or 3 minutes just letting you guys know a little bit about what we do, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jen, who's going to introduce today's speaker. A little bit about Oculus. I always like to start off talking a little bit about who our friends and partners are. Obviously, the CrisisMapper Network, a group of great people that we've been working with over the past 2 or 3 years. Some of our commercial partners there, you see Microsoft, ESRI, Ushahidi, obviously, is another one of our partners that we've been working with. And on the law enforcement side, ILEA is listed there. We also do some work with IACA, the International Association of Crime Analysts. Who are these customers that we work with on a day-to-day basis? They kind of fall into 3 different groups. We work with defense customers, public safety and law enforcement, as well as financial institutions, companies who are dealing with lots and lots of dollars. And these are some of the projects that we do here at Oculus. Really, to summarize Oculus, we are a very visually oriented company. We do a lot of research into how to present data, complex data, in a way that people can understand it and use it to make decisions. So going back to the financial group of customers there, in finance, I mean, these guys are dealing with huge amounts of data on a daily basis, and they need a way to be able to see it to make decisions. And so that's an area where we focus our research and development efforts on trying to come up with visualizations that are going to be useful so that these people can make decisions on a day-to-day basis. Some of the projects that we've worked on, again, some work with CrisisMappers over the years. The visual analytics, the VAST competition, the Visual Analytics Science and Technology Symposium, is something that we participated in over the past 4 or 5 years with a number of awards. And then Oculus publishes a number of research papers every year on our efforts towards, again, being able to visualize and show complex data. Just to give you an example of how we approach problems like this, this is a problem we had many, many years ago with customers trying to understand movement. And so here, each one of those little dots on the map represents a position where someone was at over 2 years. And so you look at this and you say, okay, well, I get a general sense that this person traveled around the U.S. quite a bit, but it really doesn't give you a sense of how they moved or where were they in the summertime or how often did they go to California. It just gives you a general sense of where they were at. If we connect those dots, you can see that we have a track between them, but we still don't have any sense of real time or chronology. So what we decided to do was, to approach this in a visual fashion, to say, well, what if we added time as the third dimension? And so here you can see a visualization of that where time is represented as the vertical, and now we can see the movement of this individual over that period of 2 years as he moves around the U.S. And so answering questions like how many trips did he make, how often does he go to California in the summertime are very simple because we can simply look at this visualization and answer those questions immediately. Some of the applications for this type of visualization, looking at GPS movement data, looking at trending. So here we have one for crime reporting, communications data, social network analysis, and financial transactions. So all different workflows you can get out of being able to see your data in this fashion. That's all for me. I'm going to hand you guys over to Jen, and she will introduce today's presenter.
Great. Welcome, everyone, to CrisisMappers webinar. I'm Jen Zimke, co-founder of the International Network of CrisisMappers, and we're really delighted today to have George Chamales with us, who's going to be discussing how our crisis maps are often susceptible to certain vulnerabilities and attacks even, and so sort of what are the security implications, what are the techniques, and the things that he's experienced, he's willing to share with us. We're really excited. I also want to thank very much our hosts, Oculus GeoTime, Adil and Curtis, have always been very kind, and we're happy to be partners with them. So without further ado, let me just turn this over now to George.
Good afternoon, folks, and good morning for those of us on the West Coast. Thanks a lot, Jen, and for this opportunity, and same to the team from Oculus and GeoTime. I'm looking through the list of people here, and I see a number of people that I recognize, and so welcome, everybody. What I'd like to do today is have a discussion about crisis mapping and crowdsourced crisis mapping from a security perspective. So a little bit about me before we get started. So I've been working in the field of crisis mapping for about the last 2 years now. And in that time, I've done a number of different projects. I've served as the technical lead for some of the crisis mapping deployments that have taken place over the last year, including the tech lead for the Libya crisis map, the PAC report map that was tracking the flooding in Pakistan, and also the second round of the Sudan vote monitor, which took place earlier this year. Along the way, I also helped co-found the Standby Task Force along with Patrick Meyer, Rob Monroe, and Anahia Yala-Iakuchi. And I've been working on a number of different projects in the space with various humanitarian actors. At the same time, I've also been doing a significant amount of work in computer security. That's actually my background. I've been working in the field for a little over 10 years now, and doing a variety of different types of jobs in the security field. And these include things primarily with the U.S. government in things like security policy, so the development of ways to have online interactions securely. Also security research and development, working with new technologies and new ways to approach security for groups like the DOE and DARPA. And in the private field, I've worked as a professional hacker, as someone who is paid by companies to test their security by playing the part of the bad guy and going after their systems. And as a result, it's left me with a breadth of experience working in the field of security and how to approach security from multiple different angles. And one of the fundamental concepts of computer security is that you have to assume that the enemy knows the system. This is what's known as Shannon's maxim. And you have to act as though the vulnerabilities of your system, of the technology that you're using, are known by the adversary, are known by people who would like to do something bad to it. And from that perspective, you can begin to see the vulnerabilities that you need to deal with to figure out how to prevent successful attacks, how to mitigate vulnerabilities being exploited. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to look at crisis mapping from the perspective of a bad guy. I'd like to take a look at the things that can go wrong based on the way that the technology is currently set up and the way that it's being deployed in the field. And in doing that, I'd also like to bring some of examples of where these sorts of issues have come up over the last several years. This technology has really been out in the field. To get started, though, I think it'd be best to lay out a quick map of crowdsourced crisis mapping, so we get a sense of what are the different components, how do they fit together. So the first step that we have in crowdsourced crisis mapping is platform administrators, people who decide to set up some kind of platform to collect messages. And once they have the platform online, they reach out to the people in the field, the crisis-affected population, the crowd on the ground, and they send out a prompt to them. This is the equivalent of where are you and what do you see? A message letting people know that this sort of platform is online, that the information is being collected, and how to send it back in. If the prompt is successful, it reaches out to the community, people respond to it. They then reply with a variety of messages, and these could be things coming in over SMS, over Facebook, Twitter, etc., that are sent and collected by the platform. That influx of messages is then turned around and processed by the crowd in the cloud. And it's interesting when you look at it like this, you can recognize that when we say crowdsourced crisis mapping, we may have as many as two different crowds in two very different locations made of two very different sets of people. And so the crowd in the cloud would be the groups of people who were processing these messages and turning them into reports that could then be shared to people, for example, response organizations who could then use them to coordinate their response efforts. And this map that we've got here is a general case. It maps very closely to what was done during the Pakistan, the PAC report deployment. And you can see how you can tweak it a little bit here and there and get a sense of other different types of deployments that have taken place. This is also very similar to the Mission 4636 deployment that took place in Haiti, where they were collecting SMS messages. The Libya crisis map deployment that we did was also very similar to this, except that we didn't do as much work with a prompt to the people on the ground, and instead we're just collecting messages that were already being generated by people on social media and by mainstream media, etc. And what I wanted to do with this sort of map is start taking a look at the different components as a general case and use it as a way to identify and look at some of the potential attacks, some of the vulnerabilities, and some of the things that can go wrong. So let's start with that prompt, that white arrow. This is the message that goes out to the people in the field. All right. So let's take a look at this white arrow, this prompt, the prompt that goes out to the people on the ground. The first concern that we have here is that the prompt is susceptible to prompt corruption. This is the idea that the message is going out to the community saying, send this information, we are here, but how easy is it to corrupt that, to make people not trust that message, either through counter messaging or some other means? And we've seen this happen already with a deployment that took place in Khartoum in Sudan. It was being used to track, I believe it was riots and violence inside of Khartoum. And a message went out on Twitter warning people, as you can see here, that the Sudanese government has infiltrated this Ushahidi site and is using it to destroy and demoralize the opposition. And this was broadcast out based on a news story that was published online. And the interesting thing about this is that this is actually false. This is not true. The site itself had posted on the site warning people to not send SMS messages to the system because they could not ensure that they weren't going to be monitored by the government. However, by the time that reached Twitter and kind of like the telephone type of process, it had been misinterpreted. And by the time it reached Twitter, the word had become, don't trust this site at all, it's been compromised. And so we have a prompt corruption type of attack that took place inadvertently, but could just as easily have been done intentionally by an opposition group. Next, we have to worry about things like population attacks. When you start crowdsourcing information, you bring people in the population into your platform, and you make them potential targets. They become, in a sense, conspirators to whatever it is that you're doing, and parties that are involved and attributed to the work that is being done on the platform. And so there is a concern that could result in people being specifically targeted and attacked for taking part in these types of deployments. Unfortunately, we've already seen this take place. Over the last couple of weeks, there's been 3 separate murders in the town of Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, that are attributed to the Zeta drug cartel. People who were killed explicitly for taking part in submitting information to online blogs, who were tracking the information about drug violence in the area. This sign was left on the bridge specifically stating that this is for people who are posting over social media information about the drug violence that's taking place. And that rope in the left-hand corner you see attached to that was one of the bodies of the people that they had killed. Last week there was a third murder where a woman's decapitated body was left in public view, along with a note saying explicitly that she had been murdered for submitting information on the Zetas to one of the online blogs, and the note included her username that she had been using. So they somehow were able to identify the person based on their username and left this as a message to people to not take part in this sort of crowdsourcing activity. Now, I'd like to take a look at the messages, that black arrow on the left side here. So as these messages are flowing out from the crowd on the ground, they're going to be using the communications network. And depending on the situation, that communications network could be potentially a potential source of a target of attack. And the first type of attack it could deal with is the idea of network disruption. This is where an organization who controls the communication network is able to stop the messages flowing across it. And we've seen this happen multiple times over the last year in places like Egypt and Libya and Syria, where the entire internet was blocked and was shut down. We've also seen more selective network disruption for things, for example, prior to the Egyptian referendum last year, there were changes made to the cell phone rules that prevented people from sending out SMS messages that could be used to give information about what was happening on the ground. And similarly with the Sudan Vote Monitor deployment, where we had our server's IP address blocked from inside of Sudan. So a very specific, very targeted disruption of our communications. And in addition to just disruption, we do have to worry about network monitoring. The concern that organizations who have access to the network will be able to use that access to snoop on the messages that are going back and forth. These pictures are taken by I believe it was the Wall Street Journal, and they show information from the inside of a Libyan, a building in Libya that they believe was used to monitor information flowing back and forth across the network. And among the things that they found were email conversations that were as early as February, Similar discoveries have been made in Egypt, and people raided the state security offices, finding significant amounts of information about themselves that was culled from electronic resources. So we do know that these organizations are monitoring the network. And in a situation where there is a crisis mapping platform set up, it would be very easy to identify those messages flowing to that platform based on the destination. It's as simple as monitoring a certain cell phone number or monitoring a website address that people are communicating with. We also have to worry about false messages, messages that are, no, it looks like we're desynchronized again. Oh, there we go. False messages. So people pretending to be members of the crowd on the ground, going through and submitting information that they know to be false into the crisis mapping platform. Again, going back to Syria, we've seen this happen, or Sudan, we've seen this happen. During the recent election monitoring deployment, they received false messages that said the equivalent of elections in such and such location is very orderly, and citizens are overwhelmingly voting for President Bashir. Something that was just obviously didn't sound right, obviously potentially planted, and people we had to determine how to deal with those messages. Another interesting case that popped up a couple of months ago was the case of a Palestinian activist who was crossing the border in Israel, and as he was crossing the border, his cell phone was confiscated briefly by the security forces, and by the time he got it back and looked at his Twitter log, he saw that there had been a number of messages posted to his Twitter account, saying that the border checkpoint that he was passing through had been closed because people were throwing rocks. So fake messages that were obviously to him submitted by the security forces while they had his cell phone. And the fascinating thing about this story is that it sounds really good, but there is still even no way of knowing if that story is true. For all we know, the Palestinian activist could have made it up as he was going through in order to make the Israeli guards look bad. And dealing with false messages can be really, really challenging. So now, back up, we've covered a lot of the different attacks that can take place on the people kind of on the crowd side. And let's start looking at the issues that face some of the other people who are monitoring this, starting off with the platform administrators, those four folks down at the bottom there. The first concern that we have with platform administrators is that there could be attacks directly on the people who are operating the platform. This would be particularly the case if those running the platform are people who are on the ground or in the same sort of conflict zone, same conflict area as the hostile groups. There have been analogous types of attacks that we have right now that we have seen, things like bloggers being arrested and imprisoned and killed for running these types of sites. At the same time, we have a very specific example of a type of attack on people operating the platform. This is a screenshot of the Ushahid platform that was being used for vote monitoring in Egypt, where during the referendum, they were approached by the security services who demanded to have a back-end administrator account on their Ushahidi system. So they were told that they would have to give that over. And they were able to do that because the people running the platform were local, were findable, and the security services obviously knew who they were. Back up, we can cover the administrators, and let's focus on the platform. This is the software system that's being used to collect these messages. And again, it could be something like Ushahidi, it could be a simple blog, it could be something that's rolled, custom-built system, similar to what was done following the Japanese tsunami. It's an online or software-based system that's being used to collect this information. And the big concern that we have here is something like a platform compromise, so vulnerabilities in the system being leveraged to allow outsiders, unauthorized people, access to that system. And software vulnerabilities exist. I've done a significant amount of work with Ushahidi, and over the last year and a half, we've patched a number of information disclosure vulnerabilities in Ushahidi that would allow people to gain access to private messages, so messages and reports that had not been made public. People could access them very, very easily through the web interface by doing something like going to a specific URL. At one point, they were showing up in the reports listing. At another point, they were showing up in the search field. And these sorts of disclosures could cause a significant amount of damage if people were able to access those messages that had not been cleared, that had not been sanitized. So speaking of messages, those messages are being processed by people in the crowd. So when we look over at the crowd and those people who are dealing with this sort of information, we do have a concern that if you are opening these messages up to the people in the internet, you have no idea who you're typically going to get. And so there is a concern for crowd infiltration, the idea that the crowd that you're reaching out to may contain people who are hostile, who are bad actors. And the best example we have of crowd infiltration is the Chinese 50 Cent Party. This is a group that is organized by the Chinese government whose job is to maintain a large group of people who scour the internet and post propaganda for the Chinese government and also identify a dissident type of information. So the Chinese government has created their own crowd that they control and that they can prompt to go off and do this sort of work. There isn't a significant amount of information about this group, although you could assume that as they get more and more sophisticated, they'll be able to maintain active online identities, like Facebook, maybe not Facebook in China, but online accounts, persona profiles that would indicate they're actual real people. The term that we use for this in the security field for these sorts of fake accounts are sock puppets. So sock puppet accounts that can be used to pose as real people acting as members of a crowd that can be directed by a potentially hostile organization. Jumping back, we've covered the crowd on the ground, the administrators, the crowd on the cloud, and that leaves the groups on the ground, the people who are actually responsible for, who are ingesting these reports and acting on them, things like response organizations. And there are two final things we'd like to talk about here. The first is the concept of responder manipulation. If false messages or messages that are inserted into the system at some point can be used to direct the activity of the responders and manipulate their actions. And we've seen this already with the SMS, some of the SMS messages that were received in Haiti. And this is an example. This is a quote from the Disaster 2.0 report that talks about how, at least for one group, 70% of the messages that they received through social media turned out to be false. There was people who were requesting search and rescue for services where they knew that their family members inside of the collapsed structures were already dead, and we're just asking them to show up to retrieve the bodies, but we're doing so by sending in false information saying that they believe the people were alive. And this in itself could have a significant slowing down effect on the response operations for people who are actually trapped and are still alive. And the final one I'd like to mention is the idea of report utilization, that after all the work that's been done, processing the messages, collecting them, verifying, et cetera, and presenting them, that information could be utilized by hostile groups for targeted attacks, et cetera. And fortunately, to my knowledge, we have not had this happen. However, we've kind of come a little bit close. During the Pakistan deployment, the PAC report deployment, the Taliban issued a statement saying that they were going to be attacking the foreign horde of aid workers inside of Pakistan. And we were here building a large map that included, among other things, the actual location of the foreign horde of aid workers in Pakistan. And I see this as being really a big concern for crisis mapping and for this technology and the use of this technology, because to go through all of this effort and to have the result of that be an attack on innocent groups, on aid and response organizations as a result of this processing would be have a significant impact on the future of crisis mapping. Now, that being said, we've gone through and just talked about 10 different types of vulnerabilities and attacks that could take place. So what I'd like to do is now take a step back and look at it from a different perspective. And to do that, let's start talking about some of the defensive things that can be done. And I'd like to talk about three in particular, three examples that we've got of ways that people have begun to approach this sort of technology and identify ways that it can be done that mitigates these vulnerabilities and prevent these successful attacks. The first is a blog post by the Standby Task Force that discusses some of the different technologies and issues around doing this sort of work in hostile environments. And they mention a number of different technologies that are out there and different capabilities, and are really useful for presenting message interception and dealing with false messages. So they're able to take care of two of these types of potential things that could go wrong. The second is the architecture that we use for the Libya crisis map deployment. When the United Nations asked that we take the private Libya crisis map and put it online, there was a number of concerns that we had regarding the utilization of this information, the potential for attacks against it, et cetera. And so we set up a distributed architecture where the messages were collected on a private server and then periodically transferred over to the public-facing site. And in the process, we stripped out a significant amount of identifiable information. And this allowed us to deal with things like concerns about message interception, message utilization, and platform compromise. And finally, this came out recently, is the user guide for data integrity, which was put together by Frontline SMS and Internews and Carol Waters over at Internews. And I have to say, from a security standpoint, this is a brilliant document for a number of reasons. It does an excellent job of identifying issues that can take place in the Frontline SMS style deployment, and explaining the different mitigation techniques, and doing so in a way that is very, very concise, very readable, and very, very useful, and does an excellent job covering the range of potential issues that people could face when dealing with Frontline SMS. And there are a number of lessons that can be taken from the Frontline SMS, the data integrity document, and applied to crowdsource crisis mapping. And they do a really good job of covering things like message interception, dealing with network disruption, false messages, and the potential for platform compromise. It's a really fantastic document. I recommend anyone who's interested in this to take a look through it. And what we see, though, is at the end of the day, having looked through these different things and some of the different steps that have been taken, is that there is definitely a need here for standards and best practices for secure crowdsourced crisis mapping, something that can be put together so that people in the field who are looking to utilize this technology, people who are looking to report and send information to this technology, can understand the risks and the vulnerabilities and the potential consequences involved in dealing with these sorts of attacks, and use this technology in a way that is safe and is secure. And I believe that once we are able to develop a set of standards and best practices, it would naturally allow us to interact with this technology in a way that is safe, that is secure, and that does cover the range of bases for this technology. And I believe that there's an opportunity here right now for the community to begin discussing it, and it's part of the reason for this presentation, for other work that I've done on the security side of things, presenting this information to folks in the security field. Over the next couple of weeks and months, we'll have a couple of other opportunities to work on this. I'll be talking with folks at the Camp Roberts relief exercise in early November. I also hope to have a self-organized session at the ICCM conference in Geneva to continue discussing this. I believe that we are in a place where it is very needed for this community, and it will really help the technology move forward. And that's everything I've got. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. And now if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thanks, everybody. Feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and I will help field that. Thanks, George. I think it's really important that you're helping catalyze a conversation around this, and I really like the way that you laid it out in a very systematic way. You kind of helped us frame this discussion and sort of wrap our minds around all the different parts and pieces. I wondered whether there was a certain aspect of this that is most difficult in your mind. In other words, are there certain ones of these that seem to me more like low-hanging fruit and it's easier to cope with? And if so, sort of which are the ones that we imagine the fruit will still be hanging last? Like, which are the most difficult ones to overcome?
Sure. I think you can break that down into a couple of different measures of difficulty. There's things that are technologically challenging, and then there are things that are challenging based on the environment. So, for example, dealing with message interception and network disruption is something that is very challenging based on the environment that you're in. If you're inside of Libya and the government controls the communications infrastructure and they can shut it off at a heartbeat, then it's very difficult to work around that. And it's been fascinating to see the work that's been done inside of Libya to deal with that. Things like organizations and individuals setting up entirely separate cell phone networks, or recapturing portions of the networking infrastructure and making that available. And at the other end, there's more of the technologically challenging things like developing secure code. And writing secure web applications, writing secure software is really challenging and really hard to do. And going through and getting software to the point where you can trust that it doesn't have vulnerabilities that people could exploit and compromise, it takes a significant amount of effort and a significant amount of thought. That being said, I think there's a lot of work that can be done for some of the low-hanging fruit on some systematic ways to eliminate some of the concerns. So, for example, dealing with crowd infiltration, some of the work that we're doing is around microtasking platform for Ushahidi, where one of the things that we could do is have a step at the very beginning where sensitive information, personally identifiable information, can be stripped out of the messages before it's turned over to the rest of the group for geolocation, categorization, et cetera. So you can potentially remove the sensitive information from that and prevent it from falling into the hands of people that you don't trust, where you're using people that you do trust for that first anonymization pass. And then other things like message utilization. I think that the Libya crisis map is a good example of this, where the standard that we developed was that it was a closed deployment, and it was only the information, the full set of analyzed, annotated information for each of these reports was only made available to existing known parties, and that was Patrick Meyer and Andre Verity were the ones who were the gatekeepers for organizations looking to deal with that. And so you've got kind of a range. Some of this stuff is going to be very difficult based on the environment. Some of it's going to be challenging from the technology, but also some of it can be dealt with just good, solid, thoughtful operational procedures and guidelines.
Sure, good. Do you think there's any vulnerabilities around the crowd in the cloud? I noticed if you maybe go back to one of those earlier slides, there's that whole segment, in other words, of the volunteers that are sort of on the standby task force or, sitting in Skype chat rooms around the world helping process a lot of this crowdsource, combing through Twitter. Do you think that they have any specific vulnerabilities that we might see, something come up in the future on the news about them being targeted, or does that seem too remote and not like a likely outcome just in your view?
Yeah, I think there's two primary vulnerabilities. The first is infiltration. People who join groups like the Standby Task Force or the UN volunteer community, and when there are open calls. And I think that right now the barriers to entry for these organizations are very, very low. I know that the Standby Task Force does try to review people's Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts and try to establish whether or not they have an online persona before allowing them into the system. But those things are very, very easy to fake, to circumvent. And then I think for the concerns about the other concern is direct attacks on the crowd in the cloud. And I didn't really mention that in this presentation, but it is a concern. I know that there were a number of folks who were taking part as volunteer members of the Standby Task Force and processing these messages during the Libyan deployment, the Libya crisis map deployment, who stopped working on it when they found out that the system was going to be taken public, because they were concerned that if the system was compromised, they could be identified, which would put them or their family members at risk. And I think that there's a number of kind of analogous types of attacks that have taken place. The Syrians a lot of this coming out of Syria, where they are attacking people specifically because of somebody else's, family members' involvement in the resistance, in the protests, et cetera. And so I think that those sorts of attacks are entirely possible, and it's definitely going to be important going forward that there are systems in place to protect the identity of the people who are taking part in this.
Yeah, We have a question coming in from Caitlin. What's an acceptable level of risk for actors on the ground, and what's the administrator's responsibility to ensure safety of the crowd?
That's an excellent question, and I think that the acceptable level of risk depends on the particular actor, and I think that there's a significant amount of variance, not only in risk but also in what reports they're interested in, what level of trust they need to have in the reports. So a group like the U.S. military, who's on the ground, they have an extremely high level of risk that they accept, and they have systems in place, body armor and guns, and to deal with that. And I contrast that with groups like the International Red Cross, who wouldn't not necessarily go into an area that was currently in a hostile state. And that was part of the reason for the Libya crisis map with the UN, was building this situational awareness because there weren't existing groups on the ground already. In terms of responsibility for administrators to ensure the safety of the crowd, I think that's a fantastic question. And I believe there's a proposal for a talk at ICCM on the liability of people who are operating these types of platforms, and what is the legal liability of inserting yourself into these types of operations. And I believe that there is a significant amount of responsibility for the people who are running the platforms, because regardless of how good and useful that this information can be to the response efforts to people on the ground, I think that that is far outweighed by the potential of something bad happening, and that's acutely the case if something very bad happens as a result of thoughtless insecure activity.
Is there currently now like a warning on CrowdMap, for people that would be standing up some maps, or just again, calling the question of, developing standards and best practices and things?
That's a really good question, and I had a very enthusiastic discussion with the folks at Ushahidi during the New Zealand earthquake around the concerns of anyone being able to set up a crowd map and the potential consequences for that. And recently I set up a crowd map for some testing, and I saw that Ushahidi had added a note in the crowd map setup page of if you are doing this in a crisis, stop and read this. And I thought, wow, this is great. They actually they're actually thinking about this. And the page that you're linked to basically boiled down to step 1. If you're doing this in a crisis, check to see if anybody else is doing it. Step 2, pick a very memorable domain name, and step 3, tell everyone about it. And which to me is the exact opposite of the message I think people should have. And I think that it completely misses the point of what are the concerns that could take place for this type of technology.
Hopefully we can continue along those lines of discussion at ICCM. We've got quite a few questions rolling in, so I'm just going to put some of these out there. Tom asks about how there's different risks by area depending on the location. He wondered what you thought might be the biggest security threats for U.S.-based deployments. In other words, should Occupy Wall Street be most concerned about anything in particular?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the earliest Ushahidi deployments I did was tracking riots in Oakland using Twitter that were taking place in downtown. And it was a fascinating experience knowing people who were on the ground, just citizens on the ground, as well as having relatives who were members of the police force and dealing with the groups on the ground. And so risk is entirely dependent on the groups that you're dealing with. I think that for groups like it depends on who's actually operating the platform. So if the platform is being operated by an Occupy Wall Street type of group, then you're in a position where if things are being published online, and this is being seen already with the groups in the UK during the riots, that that information is, if it's publicly available and includes information that can be used by law enforcement, then it's fair game to be used by law enforcement. And I think that similarly for groups like law enforcement who would be using this sort of technology to track this information, they're in the same position that a regular response organization would be in with regards to people's ability to insert false messages, to send in false reports, to manipulate their response.
Great. Anne asks, what's the potential for actually identifying the hostile parties and use this information to protect peacekeepers? For example, her organization, Nonviolent Peace Force, has peacekeepers who could use this platform in South Sudan and in the Philippines.
Yeah, that's another great question. And there's a couple of different parts of that, and the ability to attribution is something that we struggle with a lot in computer security, because it's very, very easy to do things in a way that is non-attributable across the network. And crisis mapping and crowdsourced crisis response is another, opens up another couple of avenues for that. Whereas in security, we're concerned about anonymous attacks across the internet. You have the same potential for attacks across things like social media, using sock puppet accounts, through SMS, using messages that have individual or hostile groups' cell phones, or cell phones of people that they've pulled off of protesters, et cetera. And I think that it's going to be very, very difficult to really do attribution based solely on the information that's received by a platform. I think that if you're trying to prove that a particular organization is taking a particular action or is doing something, it would take more subtle and yet direct manipulation of the people to draw them into a position where you can say, you can have incontrovertible proof that an organization was behind a set of false messages, or were trying to direct actions in one way or the other. And I think that the level of effort required in that is probably beyond the capability of many groups, and also potentially beyond the scope. So I'd say that if you're in a position where you're trying to accomplish a humanitarian mission, the best, I think it's probably the best use of your effort to understand that people are going to try to do harm to this deployment and build systems in place to prevent that harm from taking place, but not necessarily put forth a significant amount of effort to prove that there is manipulation taking and prove the parties behind it, unless that is specifically what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Sophia B. Liu asks, what concerns are there from a federal agency's standpoint to represent crowdsourced data in their own resources, given that the data may be incorrect, falsified, et cetera?
Great question, Sophia. And I hope that you're doing well, and if you're in Colorado today. The concern is dependent on how it's being used. So I think that if a federal agency is promoting that information through an official repository that's public to the world, that has a number of implications with it. I think that there's a lot of work that remains to be done on allowing veracity scores and veracity explanations to track messages as they move from platform to platform. So I think it's one thing for a federal agency to post something online saying, we've received this, with the implication that it is true. It's another thing entirely to have them post something saying, we've received this, and we're not sure that it's true, buyer beware, caveat emptor. This is why we think it is true. And it's a third thing for them to consume it internally, just in sharing it amongst government organizations with those same sets of warnings about the veracity and trustworthiness of the information.
Carol remarks that, not everyone has the expertise that you have, and Anahi and Andre, et cetera, on operating platforms in sensitive environments, repressive regimes. And she was wondering what you think the three biggest vulnerabilities might be for groups that are designing and managing such platforms that you'd like them to be aware of.
It's a good question, and part of the work that I hope that we can develop as through these discussions and through things like ICCM is a kind of a boiled down set of of standards and best practices that can be handed off to anybody who's working on this technology and would be useful for them. So a way to kind of take the information that's built up, my head and Anahi's head and Patrick's head, and from our experiences doing this sort of work, and present it to people in a way that they can consume it and understand it, and that we can keep it updated over time. That being said, I think if I had to go with the three biggest vulnerabilities, the first is that all software is insecure and really can't be trusted. So treat all software as if it's either compromised or compromisable. The second would be expect that the communications networks are not trustworthy. If you're dealing with things like SMS or the web, if you're in an area where there is an organization that operates the network, you have to assume that information can be viewed and modified. And the third would be, I think the third I'd say is to be prepared for network disruption in these sorts of situations, because it seems like hostile regimes around the world have realized that the internet in their country has an off button, and they aren't hesitating to use it. And it's definitely caught us out on a number of different occasions early on where we weren't anticipating changes to the cell phone restrictions or changes, the internet being shut off in a particular area. So expecting that that's going to go away, I think could go a long way towards preparing people to deal with that.
Great. Thank you, George. I just had a final question about the standards and best practices that we want this community to develop. Do you have any comments about the process or how we can ensure that everyone can participate, but also that it actually happens? In terms of the who should sort of spearhead this and take this on. And do you envision it as like a shared Google Doc and people starting something at the ICCM and just continuing it, or is this already existing in certain spaces at Standby Task Force within Ushahidi, et cetera, or HHI, for example, that we can tag along with? What do you think in terms of process and how, because I do think it's a really important conversation that needs to happen and to continue happening and to continue to be sort of open and editable and modifiable given change in this environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any work that's been done in this to really start to develop a cohesive set of standards and best practices. And I think part of that challenge is that there is no central standards body. There is no primary group who is responsible. And I've definitely had some initial discussions with a number of different organizations who I think have the background and the interest in helping to develop and maintain these. As far as path forward, I think that the discussions at Camp Roberts and ICCM, I think a big part of that will be around what is the best path forward. I do think that it does need to be an open discussion where all the different parties will be involved. I think that Ushahidi should definitely be at the table. I think that groups like HHI have the domain expertise, and similarly the folks from groups like the UN and people who are interested in using this technology should at the very least be aware of it. And then over time, I think it's absolutely necessary for that set of standards and best practices to be updated and to be edited. But also, and this is an excellent suggestion by John Crowley over at HHI, to periodically test them. To do these sorts of deployments in something like a Camp Roberts type relief exercise, where they're not only where we would do a deployment and then have potentially bad actors in that deployment. So they're part of the simulation. So to actually test out and field test and do field exercises where there are bad guys who are looking to do negative things to these sorts of platforms, and use that as a way to test that we are covering all the bases, to identify new attacks and new vulnerabilities before we come across them in the field.
That's a great idea. I just want to ensure that the conversation that started here, that it's also ongoing in other places, that somehow we develop a legacy around it. I mean, at the last CrisisMappers conference in 2010, there was a working group on sort of privacy, security, ethics associated with crisis mapping that touched on a few of these issues, although not as systematically by any means. we set up a shared Google Doc, but it never really went anywhere. And then, going to other meetings and other conversations with sort of some of the same people, but some new people and other people. I just want to see us sort of be able, the us, it's sort of this ecosystem, a network of networks, if you will, be able to actually establish a legacy and move it forward rather than cycling back. But I think that really your conversation that you've catalyzed here is a wonderful starting place for that, and I encourage everyone interested to join CrisisMappers insofar as it can help, and use the ICCM, the self-organized sessions, to be able to continue this conversation and get this happening. So thank you all so much for your good questions, and thank you very much to George for catalyzing this conversation, and to our partners at Oculus and GeoTime. Is there any final questions or comments? I see Heather's typing, so she's commenting on how, at this ICCM they'll have a self-organized session, and she's always typing. So thank you all very much for your time, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, George.